I don't know about you, but my brain is just saturated with all kinds of amazing insight from various different topics and subjects. So we have an opportunity to hear from another group, but then afterwards we'll have time to relax, have a dinner, drink. The beer for creativity, wine for creativity will flow, and we'll be able to connect the dots between all the incredible insights that have happened. We've had a great discussion about business and finance. I thought that was really enlightening and interesting. And we've also been talking to some of the researchers offline in these conversations today about the role that philanthropy can play in funding the research, in funding the application of that research within different types of institutions, whether that's within business or within nonprofits. And we have a great opportunity here to listen to one of our philanthropists explain their perspective on flourishing and how they fund it, how they think about it. In this particular case, we wanted to give a special thanks to Jonathan Lever for his journey to get here in the last 48 hours. As Matt mentioned, Bob Oyster unfortunately had COVID, and Jonathan just stepped right in at the last minute and showed up last night, and we had dinner together last night, and he warned me that he was going to be leaving dinner early. I thought that's totally fine given what you've just gone through to get here, and he stayed the whole night. I was totally impressed, and so he's back again, and I'm glad that he's here to share with us. But a little bit of background on Fetzer, a really unique mission within the philanthropic space. His group has a $700 million endowment. They're investing in nonprofits, research, across the board, but the real connecting dot between that, connecting thread between all of those forms of research and work is spirituality and understanding the spiritual foundation for flourishing, and really connecting the resources between the religious community, the education community, and then this nonprofit world. He's 25 years in the philanthropic world, and I'm eager to hear his background and hear his perspective on how can philanthropy help invest in and support this field and this movement of human flourishing. Jonathan?
Thank you very much, Ron. You'd think after 2 years of being on Zoom, seeing your face on a big screen wouldn't be an issue, but I'm looking at myself here, and it's a little more daunting when you have yourself there and everyone else in person. But it's a real blessing to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. And somebody says you got to go to Rome tomorrow, got to go to the Vatican. It's not exactly like a true hardship. So I just am really happy to be here. I'd like to actually begin with a brief meditation in the form of a poem by Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet. And then following the poem, I'd invite us to enter a moment of silence for reflection before we continue. And the poem is called The Real Work. There is one thing in this world that you must never forget to do. If you forget everything else and not this, there's nothing to worry about. But if you remember everything else and forget this, then you have done nothing with your life. It's as if a king has sent you on a journey to do a task, and you perform 100 of other services, but not the one that he sent you to do. So human beings come into this world to do particular work. That work is the purpose, and each is specific to the person. You say, but I spend my energies on lofty enterprises. I study jurisprudence, I study philosophy and medicine and all the rest. But consider why you do those things. They are all the branches of yourself. Remember the deep root of your being. Remember the deep root of your being. Let's take a moment of silence. Thank you. Today, I've been asked to reflect on how would a human flourishing framework transform the practice of philanthropy. But to that end, I'd like to offer some thoughts, not on the branches of philanthropy, but on the deep root of philanthropy itself. So let's start with a thought experiment. What would a historian 500 years from now say about philanthropy's contribution to human flourishing during the era in which we are living? Now, this is a question I think about, not because I'm a historian, actually a lawyer by training, but because I help lead the Fetzer Institute, a philanthropic foundation established with a 500-year mission to help build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Now consider what it means to lead an institution that thinks not in 3-year plans or 5-year plans, but in swaths of hundreds of years. When you adopt this 500-year lens, one's imagination really opens up. As Carl Jaspers wrote in his book, The Origin and Goal of History, from about the 8th century BCE to the 3rd century BCE, a roughly 500-year period, which he called the Axial Age, the foundation of just about every major religion and philosophical system emerged. Taoism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Confucianism, classic Greek philosophy, Judaism, and Christianity. But to answer the historical thought experiment about philanthropy's contribution, however, I think we need to ask an even more basic question. What does the human family need now for which philanthropy can usefully and meaningfully contribute? So at the Fetzer Institute, we believe that what the human family needs now more than ever is a renewed, what I'll call, cultural operating system. Because operating systems, like the stories that we tell ourselves, function in the background, yet they ultimately shape our thoughts and our actions. And we wouldn't describe our renewed operating system as Windows or Mac OS or Linux. Instead, we call our operating something that the marketing folks would really hate. We'd call it our shared sacred story operating system. More on that in a second. While much of philanthropy today funds more and more programs that are incredibly important, they are inspiring, they ultimately create amazing good in the world, it's not enough to change the embedded operating systems that actually drive our thoughts and actions. So more of the same philanthropy is, I would say, to mix up my metaphors, like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And here's why. We are at an inflection point at the end of the Enlightenment experience, facing an existential crisis of our own making. The essence of this crisis is that we've become incredibly more powerful as a human species, while becoming dramatically less capable of using that power for the flourishing of humanity. These are not unrelated phenomena. Both are the inevitable consequence of the Enlightenment's embrace of science and reason and its rejection of the spiritual way of understanding reality. The Enlightenment experiment is now collapsing under its own weight, both of its successes and its failures. This collapse seems inevitable, but only because we're trying to address it within the Enlightenment's own distorted misunderstanding of reality. If instead we reclaim the spiritual way of knowing and bring it into a much more balanced relationship with science and reason, we'll be able to give a deeper, truer, and more life-affirming account of reality. And we will find within that account the solidarity and love to build a flourishing world. As I mentioned earlier, our cultural operating system matters. We all live within and are guided and constrained by our culture's story and the nature of reality and our place in it. All such stories must address the fundamental questions of our human existence. How did the cosmos come to be? Does it have meaning and purpose? What's the good life? What values should guide us toward it? How should we live together? What happens when we die? A culture's story or operating system works, that is, it sustains personal and collective flourishing, only if we believe it to be true and find within it the love, the hope, the wisdom, and the courage to successfully meet the challenges of life. You can think of a culture story or operating system as having 4 building blocks. It's assumptions about the ways of knowing through which we understand the reality. I'm not a philosopher, but I've been listening enough to know that some of you all call this our epistemology. Second, it's the understanding of the nature of reality itself, our ontology. It's understanding of the human person and human flourishing. It's anthropology. And fourth, it's vision of the sort of society most conducive to flourishing at all, our social vision. At the foundational level of epistemology, a culture's story or operating system must, in broad terms, choose one of these 3 paths. It can rely on the spiritual way of knowing, supported by reason, the scientific and rational ways of knowing, or a balanced and complementary deployment of all these forms of knowing. This epistemological choice really has profound consequences. The Middle Ages, often referred to as the Age of Faith, necessarily chose the first option because a powerful scientific method had yet to emerge. With the emergence of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment chose the second option, enthusiastically embracing science and reason while largely rejecting the spiritual way of knowing. This fateful choice led the Enlightenment to, one, a materialist, reductionist, determinist understanding of reality. Second, an atomistic understanding of human beings as radically separate individuals, searching for personal meaning and purpose in inherently meaningless and purposeless reality. And third, a social vision committing to providing individuals with maximum freedom as they compete based on their own subjective values for scarce economic and psychic resources. Now, the Enlightenment's early fruits, the scientific and technological revolutions, the rule of law, liberal democracy, free market capitalism, universal education, the list goes on, unquestionably and dramatically improved the human condition. But the Enlightenment's later fruits have been increasingly bitter, as it has consumed its inherited spiritual, moral, and social capital without the ability to replenish it. Despair and disillusionment have increasingly seeped in. As the institutions of the state, the economy, and mass culture have become ever larger and more powerful, they have increasingly become the individual's masters rather than its servants. As more and more of us have moved to cities and suburbs, we've lost our transcendent connection to the natural world. As technology has become ever more powerful and the consumer economy ever more voracious, the destruction of the natural world has accelerated apace. These trends are just not sustainable. The cultural operating system of the Enlightenment is no longer working. The Enlightenment experience is approaching its collapse. And this collapse is coming not because the Enlightenment has failed to realize its vision, but actually because it has been wildly successful. Doubling down on the cultural operating system of the Enlightenment isn't the answer. The key to finding a new and renewed cultural operating system that can support flourishing for the future is to reconsider the spiritual way of knowing. It is there that the human family has historically found the wisdom and the transcendent connection to guide our path, open our hearts, and give us hope. And I think here philanthropy can help. If the scientific way of knowing involves stepping back from reality and seeking to understand it from the outside in, the spiritual way of knowing is opening to reality from the inside out. It takes many forms, some explicitly spiritual, such as prayer, contemplation, and mystical experiences, but also imagination, intuition, direct apprehension, noetic experiences. For millennia, humanity has relied on this way of knowing as its primary method for probing the deepest questions of existence. Ultimately, this inquiry reaches the deepest question of all. Is there a dimension of reality beyond the material world? And if so, what is its nature? This is a question almost entirely beyond the reach of science. If an answer is to be found, we will find it largely through our spiritual knowing. Humanity has probed this question most intensely over the longest period of time within the great faith and spiritual traditions. And their deep convergence on the sacredness of reality is striking. None of them has probed the mystery of existence and found it to be meaningless. Instead, all have found it a sacred spiritual reality within and beyond the material world. The mystery of existence is a sacred mystery. If we reclaim the spiritual way of knowing and bring it into a more balanced relationship with science and reason, the stronger epistemology will lead us to a fundamentally renewed cultural operating system that is both more accurate and more life-affirming than that provided by the Enlightenment. Shaking off the grip of the Enlightenment's reductionist science and opening our hearts and minds to what is going on within and around us, we realize that we and the world are not mundane, but in fact miraculous. The arc of a blessed and well-lived life should astound us all. The miracle of conception and birth, the acquisition of language, the unfolding of body, mind, and spirit, the experience of loving and being loved, the inescapable longing for a connection to something larger than ourselves, and the capacity for reflection and the gaining of wisdom and the deep satisfaction of being part of creating the world. If we are alive and we are awake, we can only respond to these miracles, as we've talked about today, with awe and wonder. And this awe and wonder only deepens when we move from our personal stories to the story of the universe. On reflection, we realize that none of this had to exist at all. The cosmos could have been nothing but chaos, as barren and lifeless as the moon. Instead, over an incomprehensible span of 14 billion years, the cosmos has moved toward even greater order and complexity, ultimately creating a planet fit for life, birthing life, and bringing forth the miracle of human consciousness. Turning inward toward that consciousness and contemplating the richest of our own interior lives, the miracles multiply. We find that we are free beings making choices that matter. We have the free will that the Enlightenment's ontology can't explain and is forced to deny. We have strong moral intuitions that we experience not as mere subjective preferences, but somehow as part of the fabric of reality. And as we turn outwards, we see that our journey is part of a larger spiritual journey of the human family, and that there is so much to gain and learn from those who have in fact gone before us. Here we are drawn to the great faith and spiritual traditions, where the distilled spiritual wisdom of the human family resides most robustly. We see how each faith and spiritual tradition has intensely engaged the sacred mystery for centuries, many for millennia, and that each has come away with its own rich sacred story that offers answers to our deepest questions. Each has also developed powerful transformative rituals and practices, supportive spiritual communities, and comprehensive ethical frameworks. Judaism, my tradition, as Erica mentioned, offers us the ethical framework of tikkun olam, the idea that each of us has a role to play in repairing the world. As we search for the essential spiritual foundation for the human family, surely the headline for the 21st century should not be the differences between these sacred stories of faith and spiritual traditions, but their incredible convergence. All of the traditions tell us that there is a spiritual reality within and beyond this material world, that this sacred mystery that is known across traditions by many different names has love at its core, and that it infuses the entire cosmos with meaning, purpose, and sacred connection. All of them also affirm that we are embodied spiritual beings, created for love, called to love, and capable of love. This affirmation that sacred mystery holds us in love is the most radically hopeful thing we could possibly say about our human situation. The Enlightenment's reductionism has primed us to reject this possibility, but do we really want to be bound by an operating system whose world is collapsing? As mentioned previously, all the sacred traditions tell us this good news is actually true. Science is increasingly open to the possibility that it is true. A deep yearning in our hearts wants it to be true, and our world desperately needs it to be true. We can only know for ourselves whether it is true if we open ourselves to love and commit to love. Given the state of our world, isn't this a chance we ought to take? If we do, we can begin to see a sacred ontology and anthropology that forms the basis of a renewed cultural operating system that flows from reclaiming the spiritual way of knowing. And the implications of embracing this renewed cultural operating system are far-reaching. If you think of love as the lover's wholehearted desire for communion with the beloved and the flourishing of the beloved. Compared to our current cultural norms, these two commitments define a radically new way of being in the world. The commitment to be in communion is a commitment to be in the deepest possible relationship with the beloved, to want to understand them and to share their life at the deepest heart level. The commitment to flourishing is a commitment to do all within one's power to support the unfolding of the beloved's full human potential. This vision becomes even more radical still when we realize that the beloved is everyone and everything. The sacred traditions affirm with a single voice that love embraces all persons, all life, and all of reality. When we commit to love, our circle of care must likewise embrace all. The instrumental I-it relationships are no longer an option, either with other people or with the natural world. I-thou relationships become the norm. Imagine how different our planet would be, or our democracy would be, if we were each operating from such a sacred operating system. It is a vision of solidarity and love for the flourishing of all and for all life. When a critical mass of us embrace love as the basis for our common life, we will recover both our ability to work together and a shared vision of the world we want to build together. In a big history frame, then, the story or cultural operating system being offered here is one of a historical dialectic, that of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. If the Middle Ages was the age of faith, thesis, and the Enlightenment was the age of reason and science, antithesis, then our hope for the future lies in a cultural operating system that emerges from a synthesis of faith, reason, and science. This is a vision of history moving forward, not backward, toward a new wholeness and fuller flourishing. It is a vision for a stronger epistemology yielding a deeper, truer account of the nature of reality and the human person, which in turn leads to a social vision of a sacred world of shared flourishing grounded in love. Whether this renewed cultural operating system can emerge and take hold quickly and powerfully enough to birth a new life-affirming order before our current one collapses is really the urgent question of our time. If it does emerge, it will be through an open global process of co-creation, and none of us can anticipate the full richness of what might develop. But we can begin to see and act on these foundational premises. Instead, the urgent need of our time, Indeed, the urgent task of our time, and where I believe the deep root of philanthropy lies, is to accelerate the renewal of a cultural operating system and to catalyze a movement around it. From our experience at Fetzer, persons and organizations around the world and across all fields of human endeavor are being drawn toward their own versions of the love-based vision analogous to what I've described here, and are already working for spiritually grounded individual and social transformation. This extraordinary gathering is just one case in point, as are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other gatherings like this that go by different names but are pointing in the same general direction. At present, many individuals and groups are largely working in isolation on discrete initiatives, unaware that they are tackling other pieces of the larger project of cultural renewal, and that together they constitute the beginnings of a comprehensive movement we might call a shared sacred movement based on a shared sacred story operating system. Beginning to lift up this vision I've articulated today has the potential to empower this nascent movement in three important ways. First, it will offer a macro vision that enables this emerging movement to become more self-aware. Individuals who've had the dispiriting sense of working alone will have the empowering realization they're actually part of a vastly larger and more powerful effort. Second, this vision can become a North Star for the myriad participants in this radically decentralized movement to create momentum for its continued unfolding. And third, it will be the inspirational vision that draws ever more people and organizations into it. In considering the necessary conditions for success, this emergent movement must be grounded in and empowered by what I'll say capital L love, transcendent or divine love. It will unleash transformative ways of human love as well, as it remains grounded in and empowered by divine love. That said, this emerging movement can and should embrace people with open arms of goodwill. Wherever human love is at work in the world is empowered by divine love, whether it acknowledges it or not. In this profound sense, all who stand in solidarity in human love are already standing in solidarity with divine love. Indeed, history is full of examples of divine love flowing more powerfully through the open hearts of persons who say they do not believe in God or a higher power than through the more grudging hearts of many who profess that they do. The sacred traditions stand in special and fraught relationship to this idea. In their highest and most life-affirming expressions, they are vital to this movement's success. But in their all too common dogmatic and divisive expressions, they become the biggest barriers to that success. Thus, as we face the urgent need for spiritual renewal at a global scale, sacred mystery is calling each of the faith traditions to take up two great tasks, one that's internal and one that's external. The internal task is that of renewing itself so that it can more powerfully bear its own unique and luminous witness, the love that is at the heart of sacred mystery. The external task, entirely dependent, by the way, on the internal one, is to join with other faith traditions and spiritual traditions, with people of faith outside the traditions, and with all people of goodwill to begin the great common work of reimagining and remaking the world through the lens of love. Whether the 21st century is a century of collapse or renewal will turn on whether this operating system takes hold and a movement around it grows quickly and powerfully enough to birth a new life-affirming order before our current one collapses. Accelerating this movement's growth and increasing its power is thus one of the most important works for us all during this time. It is obviously and undoubtedly the work of the Fetzer Institute. We are committing to devote more than $300 million through the end of this decade, and we hope other philanthropic institutions will see the hope, the power, and strategic value of helping to renew our cultural operating system and catalyzing a shared sacred movement around it.